Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Of course, I am Constantine Martelli. We have our good co host GSP here. And just a brief announcement before the show starts. Because I know our current platform is, let's just say, a bit unreliable, and I'm sure you've seen people who have had some content taken down or lost their channels or whatever. I have created a couple of alternatives that I will be posting the show on beforehand as soon as I get the details worked out with that. Of course, we have the BitChute channel, which is just, once again, just mirrors the videos, so it'll be exactly the same. And this is still a work in progress, but I will be putting the links down there if you want to check it out. And as soon as I figure out all the technical sides of it, it will be up. I did create a Substack page. I am not going to charge anything for it. I haven't decided whether I'm going to start writing or not because that is a possibility. I might write some supplementary materials for the show. But once I get the technical side figured out, I will be uploading MP3s of every episode on there as well. So if anything ever happens here, or if just out of principle you prefer to use a different platform, uh, those are two you'll have to choose from. And I'm also taking a look into expanding into other platforms more in the future. And I'm sorry to say, and I know this is going to be very disappointing to you. No, we are not on Rumble yet, but there, I suppose there will come a day when I'm completely out of options that we will join Rumble. But without further ado, we have quite a bit of news to cover. Now, last week's episode was fantastic. Of course, Geo joined us again, so we got to cover a lot of ground. There's a couple stories last week just because of how long we went that we didn't get a chance to touch on. Some news about events over in East Asia, which we'll get to towards the end of the show. But without further ado, it has been what one could say a monumental week in Ukraine. So I'll hand it over to you to give us a brief report of what happened over the past week or so.
Yes, just about everything happened. Um, I can't, I don't even know where to begin describing what can only be seen as a turnaround in Russia's prosecution of the war. Uh, we spoke on the last show about all the red lines and the speculation of whether anything would happen now that the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea to mainland Russia was attacked. The death toll has gone up to 4. There was a amateur historian couple that from St. Petersburg that was killed, and a judge from Moscow. And of course, the poor guy who was driving the truck. It looks like um, he was not aware that his truck was filled with bombs. Um, now that the dust has settled, and there's this whole complex procedure that happened in order to facilitate this attack, and it was sometime in August. This truck made its way to Bulgaria, and from Bulgaria it went over to Georgia. There was a stopover shortly in Armenia. Then it went into Russia, and then it went from Russia over the Crimean Bridge, and that was that. Now, and we discussed it. We discussed this on the show last week that there are no X-ray machines for vehicles going into Crimea, but only for vehicles leaving Crimea, entering Russia, which seems like an incredible oversight, and in a way, it subconsciously indicates like what Russia considers Russia. Uh, it's I suppose it's quite unconscious, maybe. I can't. I don't know the reasons why that would be the case, but now I would assume they will have X-ray machines going both ways. It could have been that maybe they just wanted to facilitate quicker movement across the bridge. In any case, what followed on the 10th was, I mean, the closest thing you could compare it to is maybe the first 2 nights after the invasion of Ukraine. It still wasn't at the same level of shock and awe that America did in Iraq and Afghanistan, um, or even Libya for that matter, but it was the most that Russia has ever done. So thermal plants, generator stations, water supply, electricity. All of this was taken out in multiple cities.
Anything that wasn't
Um,
a nuclear plant that got hit to some
yes,
degree, more or less.
yeah, because that would, yeah. So they're quite conscious of like how bad that could be if they did that. So that was avoided, even though Chernobyl, the town was hit, not the 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 nuclear plant itself. But these attacks ranged all the way from Lvov to Kiev to Odessa, Zaporozhye. Uh, I mean, there really is way too many cities and towns to mention. I believe that Kiev itself and the environs around it received something like 100 strikes. Uh, Kiev and Kharkov were without subway service for several days, without electricity. There are still in some areas of the country that there are rolling blackouts. Uh, uh, some of the NAFO accounts disappeared because they have no, they don't have internet. Now, it should be said, the attacks are ongoing, and military targets were also hit, including some kind of a barracks recruitment center uh, uh, just west of Kiev, not far from Kiev. This is another area that was attacked previously with two drones, and the drones got in there very easily. And this happened the week before. So I think Russia knew that there was a serious air defense problem in Ukraine, that a lot of its air defense systems have been moved to the front line in the south and in the east, and this has left the country wide open. Um, of course, all the energy that's unavailable has also stalled the war machine. Um, think of all the places that are there to anything from repairing tanks to providing even food for the army, all the logistics of command that are necessary. All of those things were stalled. It may even have stalled another counterattack by Ukraine in either, uh, that Liman northern Lugansk area, or along Kherson in the south. So I think a lot of people were very surprised. They did not believe that Putin would do this. The heart in your heart Putin memes started to flow on Telegram. Um, so this has changed quite a few things, but to really make an effect, Putin would have to do this every day for several weeks.
Agreed. And I think the more interesting point about this, and not necessarily because of his skilled, although he is skilled, but because of his reputation, is they put Surovikin, who was the commander of the Russian forces in Syria, in charge of this particular attack, and he has been moved to the Ukraine front in front of this. And of course, there have been the various memes about him. Various you're telling me about some of the North FC memes that they made about him, just because yeah, he looks exactly like the guy from that. It is almost uncanny, but allegedly, and again, this is just based on reports that came out with no real evidence to back them up. He was given clearance to use anything that isn't a nuke in order to reverse this situation. And as you were saying, this seemed to have been a one time strike. It did delay the Ukrainians, it did put a bit of disarray there. They did hit some command centers, but ultimately it doesn't look like this is going to be a sustained campaign. And perhaps that is on the table for later. Perhaps they're not playing all their cards right now. But once again, it goes back to this slow burn approach, for better or for worse, that Russia seems to be approaching this war with. And I will say, although looking at the realities of the battlefield, I would completely concur with a lot of the critics of the way the war has been conducted thus far, that something harder and faster needs to be done. But there also is this consideration that if we're looking at the situation from the political perspective, as we've seen with the referenda and the annexations of a lot of the Novorossiya territory, I doubt that's the last territory they intend to hold referenda in. And at that point, you want to not destroy too much of what you're going to be reintegrating because that's only more of a process for rebuilding later. So I will say that much, but I mean, this was a completely different approach from Russia during this war because it did take it from a special military operation. Now, it still officially is a special military operation, but it took it from the context of we're doing this pinprick operation in Ukraine to the point where we're actually having a sustained campaign in Ukraine where we might actually have to dig in our heels and start hitting heavy targets, so to speak. So it does show perhaps at least some voice in the Kremlin, and maybe it's a capitulation to popular opinion who want a more aggressive stance to this war. Maybe it's just the realities. Maybe it's because they thought they've waited out the West long enough to the point where they had less of a chance to anticipate a response, and that they wanted to get close to winter to make sure NATO didn't do anything. Because NATO's statements this week were pretty tail in between their legs. I'll get into those later. But for a variety of factors, it seemed to have been put off after this point, but they've finally done it. And while, again, that did appear to be a one time thing thus far, I wouldn't be shocked if you saw a more sustained campaign of this in the future. But conversely, I also wouldn't be shocked if it was just once or twice.
Yeah, it could go either way. I don't think Ukraine is going to give up. It, of course, in large part, what Ukraine does entirely depends on what the West can do and what the West is able to tolerate. Um, we should mention that SBU headquarters was hit. We'll never know exactly how many SBU agents were killed, but we know that the SBU commissar of like digital intelligence, basically the guy that's partly responsible for NAFO, but more importantly for people basically outing anybody that they suspect is pro-Russia in Ukraine. These are the people that the track criticism of the army, uh, and we don't know what happens to them. Um, so there have been important targets that have been taken out, and I suppose that there was a lull for quite some time because Kiev hadn't been attacked in like 4 months, maybe 5 months, and no one expected this. It was so thorough that it has thrown the West into a panic. The Pentagon stated that most of our support will now be air defense, and the fact of the matter is, that's what France said. That's what Britain said. All the countries that are supporting Ukraine now are rushing to get them any kind of air defense system into Ukraine that they can. The problems, of course, is training. Many of these systems, they don't know how they're going to. The Ukrainians do not know how to make them work, and of course, this is a layered process. So you don't just have, let's say, an S-300. You're going to have a Buk or some other kind of air defense system for shorter range, for something that it can detect aircraft at lower levels of altitude, right? You don't just like have, one Patriot thing stationed there and that's it. And I mean, even Israel is and Saudi Arabia. I don't know if they're donating anything, but I've remembered reading some headlines this week about how the Patriot system has not always proven to be all that good, either in Saudi Arabia and to a lesser extent, it's the same story in Israel. Um, so this is the next footing. We should have no illusions. Several countries, France is one of them, is paying hundreds of millions of dollars to get 155 millimeter rounds. all of Europe is absolutely scrambling to get more munitions and vehicles and other military aid into Ukraine. I've seen some of the wreckage now, particularly in Kherson, where uh, lots of destroyed Ukrainian tanks. Um, they're going to need more, and the Pentagon has said that they're eventually going to move from Soviet era to modern U.S. era and NATO tanks. Um, there is a new batch of 12,000 Ukrainian troops that are going to be trained. I believe it'll be split between Germany and Poland. If people remember better than I do, then you can let me know in the chat. But they should be ready by December. Now, Putin today made a very interesting comment. Of the 300,000 conscripts that they wanted of the reserves, 223,000 have shown up, and they are not going to conscript anymore. There are 70,000 Russians who have volunteered, and they've waited for months to join the battle. There are also 70,000 Chechens who have already started moving into the front. Then Putin made another statement that really surprised me. 16,000 have started to trickle into the front lines. Though front lines might be a bit of a stretch, because it could also very well be that these guys are going to be taking care of sort of the rear space, as it were, rather than front line, which will free up soldiers that have had to do that to take care of the rear space of the front lines, and particularly monitor for terrorism in towns and whatnot, keep civil order and all that. So, and in any case, wherever they end up, they are going to free up um, a lot of hands. Um, as you said, the front line is mostly very stable. There have been pinprick attacks by the Ukrainians all along the southern front, all the way from here, from the west side of Kherson, all the way to Ugledar, Zaporozhye. Um, they have not been successful. Um, Last week there was a major retreat by the Russians in the western part of Kherson, on the west bank of the Dnieper River, and that has stabilized. However, in Donetsk, there have been, and actually the only gains that the Russians have made have been in three different areas of Donetsk and Lugansk. So the first area is Avdiivka. Avdiivka is this town right next to Donetsk city, and really, like, there's all kinds of roads and houses. It's one of those agglomerations that has, like, where does it even end, right? If you're just looking at a map, it's just this sprawling space. But in any case, this is Avdiivka, which is connected to Donetsk city, and it has now been cut off from the east, and the west, and the south. There is only an escape route from the north. This has been the hardest nut to crack for the Russians since the beginning of the special military operation. Bakhmut. Now, the Russians have pressed even further. I've seen various videos. They are now further into the city than they were last week. The show was recorded 6 days ago, our last show. The entire road from the south now is completely captured. So there is no transit anymore from Bakhmut to Avdiivka and all these other areas. That's over with. Soledar, for the Ukrainians, they are still holding on. There were some minor gains. The other big, well, not big gain, very little gain, is the front around Liman. We discussed in the show, Liman fell about a week. I think October 4th is when it fell. It fell like 10 days ago. There was not enough steam for the Ukrainians to take Savatove, which is like a major hub. Small town, but it has a rail system, and it's important for the Russians, logistically speaking. The Russians have now retaken some territory around there, and they've retaken Kremenaya and I believe one other town. So, but there are reports that a force of 20 to 40,000 Ukrainians is amassing in that area. So it's uncertain what's going to happen. I have seen the Russians preparing to defend this area. They have set up this kind of Maginot line where they have started digging trenches, deep trenches that'll make it difficult for the tanks to cross. And then along that trench, they've set up these concrete pylons, again, to make it difficult for tanks to go through. So they are deeply concerned about any further gains for the Ukrainians in the north. Part of the reason for this is no matter how good the news is about the Russians taking Bakhmut, and I can say this, the reason the Ukrainians are leaving Bakhmut is because now there is no threat to Slavyansk from the north. If the Ukrainians have taken so much territory from the north that any attack by the Russians against Slavyansk, which was coming from the north, now the Russians got stalled in that forest, the Sherwood Forest area, for months and months, and there was no progress because there was also not enough manpower. And a lot of that manpower, either their contract ended in August or they were transferred down to Kherson. So there was a juggling act that the Russians had to do, and as a result, they've lost the ability to pincer Slavyansk. So that would lend credence that the Ukrainians are going to gradually withdraw from Bakhmut, and they're going to station themselves now in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. These are towns easily as big as Bakhmut, which is about 100,000, maybe 110,000 with Solidar. So you're looking at an agglomeration that is 200,000 with Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. I would bet that the Ukrainians are going to hole up in there. I don't think they're going to retreat any further for the winter. So that's what I think is going to happen there. The other really interesting thing that's happening in Ukraine from a military analysis point of view is I didn't mention this like on the last show. Maybe you did. I can't recall. But Lukashenko said that he's going to put the railway system under military command structure. I didn't know what to make of it because, there's a lot of things he says. And, you can't always trust what the Telegram channels are saying. But now 6 days have passed, and it looks like there is something developing in Belarus. The
Yes, and
Russians
even
are
the
going,
Ukrainians have reacted to that, where they have been detonating bridges that are
yes,
between Ukraine and Belarus. And that, I mean, people have speculated about that front since the beginning of the war. I believe there were actually some Russian troops stationed that attacked from Belarusian territory, although Belarus was not officially involved in the war. So the speculation has been flaring up yet again, but instead of it's much more based on reality this time than it was in previous months. So let's put it that way.
yeah. So now I think we can talk about it. They're going to do some joint exercises. Lukashenko has said things like, they're going to do another coup. He didn't use those words exactly, but he was basically saying there's going to be an invasion, and there are saboteurs already at work in Belarus. I wouldn't discount it, but I'm just saying the guy can be a bit of a character. Um, that doesn't mean what he's saying is untrue, or one shouldn't heed what he's saying. But it looks like something is developing there. But my gut feeling is Russia will be happy to pretend, like, to make a feint there in order to preoccupy the Ukrainians, right? I would suspect that they will do that before there's more air defense systems coming in. The Germans have already given them, I believe, two Iris-T air defense systems already are in Ukraine. So my guess is, if they really wanted to attack, this is not going to be like it was in February. And the main reason is I'm pretty sure that the Ukrainians have set up mines, and it's not going to be like it was in February. It will not be easy to overtake. So, and that's always been my reasoning why, you know, I've been disappointed with some of the manpower blunders that have been going on. Because yes, okay, this town is not important. Yes, there are less than 3,000 people living there. It used to be a population of 10,000. I get it. I understand, but it's still territory, and they still have important logistical um, hubs there that are of value. And retaking them now, you're going to have to do demining, like all of that stuff. So, are are the Ukrainians cognizant of this? Probably. Do they think it could still happen? I think so, because I think they know that, like, the Russian Air Force right now could wreak even more damage to central and western Ukraine if they wanted to, but they're letting this slip, right? They're letting this slip. Again, um, there is a tremendous cultural difference that has happened in Ukraine that I think the Russians are not um, willing to recognize. And that is, you look at the staff, like Surovkin is probably a guy like my age. He was in a Spetsnaz unit in Afghanistan, but um, you look at the command, and all these guys are a little older than the Ukrainian generals. Not all of them, but generally speaking, they're about 10, 15 years older. And basically, I would say any of the generals who like have, you know, warm feelings towards the Russians, or guys that they went to military school, they're not in the command structure anymore, or they know what would happen to them if they blundered anything. There's no, the ideological purity in conjunction with the power structure in Ukraine now is so strong, no one dares to move outside of it. One of the interesting things that Academic Agent was saying this week was, uh, first it's just about obtaining power, but then ad hoc or post hoc, one uses an ideology that has been, already in the air, as it were. And eventually, that ideology becomes so strong, it creates outcomes rather than outcomes force it to change strategy, right? It starts to create a reality rather than reality challenging it. And you see this in the West too, right? Just the last 6 years, especially the last 2.5, are, I think, make that abundantly clear. And so Sorokin seems to be like a guy that is not playing that game, or he's been given a longer leash. Um, Only time will tell. It's been 4 days of heavy bombing. Today, less so than other days. Um, in another statement today, Putin said something like they had 29 important targets, and I don't know, 22 were taken out or whatever. And in any case, it remains to be seen. The other really big news is the the really spectacular use of drones by the Russians. Now, whether it's the Geron or the Lancet, the Geron is the Iranian one, and apparently um Israel, through its Mossad intelligence, is giving information to Ukraine for the technology used in the Geron. Um, but also the Lancets are being used. And we had this crazy, crazy story happen yesterday where two MiG-29s, now there have been six planes that have been lost in the last 24, 48 hours, but two MiGs have either collided with a drone or the drone hit them. One of them apparently hit the cockpit. It's not known whether uh, the MiG shot the drone and then was moving so fast it's the wreckage of the drone while it was still in the air smashed into it. In any case, there are videos of like locals in this area where the planes have crashed. I don't know the fate of the pilots myself. I don't know what has happened, but this is another. This is something else that has really begun to worry the Ukrainians is that the Russians have caught up on the drone warfare, and really now the only way for this war to speed up is by Putin going harder. Because if he doesn't, this war is going to drag on further and further.
Yes, certainly, and I think that has been the cry since about August at least. I know that's when things really started to stagnate. When the complaints of Rush's underperformance actually started to hold some weight, as opposed to people who either had an ideological bend or who were just outright pessimistic. Not that we're the most optimistic crew on the internet, but still, like even like people who were willing to give this no opportunity at all. But as I was saying earlier, and as you had brought up earlier, that it seemed the situation has stabilized for both sides, and it's really anyone's game. Whoever makes the first breakout move will have initiative in this war, because after about 5 or so weeks of Ukraine having the initiatives, able to wage these counteroffensives, able to push back some of the Russian progress to the point where it looked like they were actually about to negate all of the Russian progress in the past 6 months, it appears that has been given a hard halt. Now, they still did gain quite a bit. That did come at a pretty heavy cost. They are on their eighth mobilization round right now, so it was a very. I don't want to use the term human wave because it doesn't really give the right impression, but it was a costly campaign in casualties overall. And with it, it looks like once again whoever is willing to make that first breakout move will be the one who has initiative in this war. And the comments from NATO have not been encouraging, at least for the Ukrainian side either. I'll get into the European news in more detail, but what NATO had said is it came out and it reaffirmed its commitment to uphold Article 5 if any NATO members are attacked, but Ukraine is not a member of the alliance at this time, so that would not apply to that, and that this is not NATO's war. And they keep doing this pivot back and forth where they want it to be very clear that they have nothing to do with this war, but they're also on the Ukrainian side to the point where they have the plausible deniability while also being able to support a war effort against Russia. So they're walking on a very fine line right now in between their official neutrality and where they truly stand, because they have no interest in escalating this conflict. And with the state of Europe and NATO as a whole, you can see why, as we'll get into in the next
Yeah.
couple minutes here. But
Well, I mean, nobody sums it up more than Jen Stoltenberg's comments this week. He said that if Russia wins in Ukraine, it's a defeat for NATO. I mean, well, Ukraine's not a NATO country though, and yet he said it.
yes, and it is funny because that does encapsulate everything, but they are behaving as if NATO has Ukraine is in NATO and NATO is behaving as if Ukraine is a key member in all but actually invoking Article 5. They're giving the material support, they're giving the military support, they're giving just about everything they can without a direct confrontation with Russia. And even that isn't necessarily uniform because there were some dissenting comments this week and some semi dissenting comments, if you want to be generous, including those from Macron, which I'll get into in a couple minutes here. But the last story I had about Ukraine was the entire Elon Musk saga. Now, I've made it clear back when it was first speculated he was going to buy Twitter, speaking of which, apparently the Twitter deal is also underway again. It's just working through some legal issues and everyone is kicking and screaming about it. But Elon Musk, through his various tech companies, has actually been providing the internet connection for Ukraine after their internet connection got knocked out within the first few days of the war. And that has been through the Starlink system. It's a satellite internet system. Now, you actually go through his Twitter, and he's willing to divulge quite a lot more than I would expect about any other company to, or any other head of any company to, where he's saying he's going through just vague details about what he has to do, how much money he has to sink in a month in order for this operation to take place. How, because it is a military operation, they do have to protect themselves against cyber attacks and possible physical attacks against their infrastructure. And once again, it's mostly a satellite system. There have been some more, let's say, hawkish claims on the Russian side, or hawkish calls on the Russian side, to fry their satellites with whatever technology or whatever weapons they may have to do that, which there are theoretically ways to do that, and Russia does have the technology to do that, but that would be very costly to more satellite systems than just that, and it would be a last-ditch effort on par with actually launching a nuke itself, at least in my opinion.
Yeah,
But Musk, at this point, hasn't even said he was going to pull services. He's just asking the Pentagon
I
to
think he
pay.
did for 1 or 2 days.
Yes, he did for a couple days. They're back now, but at this point, he's just hardballing the Pentagon or somebody to pick up the tab for it, because a lot of this has come from the work of, I don't know if you'd want to call it charity, but it's come out of the pocket of Starlink, and it's
He's losing 10 million a month.
yes, and I saw upwards of 20 million a month, and he said
Oh wow.
that thus far, with everything he said to invest in it, it has been about a $120 million sink. Now, keep in mind this is one of the richest men in the world, with some of the most profitable companies in the world, but it's still his personal fortune, it's still his company's fortunes that he's investing in this geopolitical conflict, and he wants something back from the feds, and he wants something back from just any government, whether that be the Ukrainians, who are getting several billions every few months, can certainly compensate Musk for his services, whether it be the Pentagon or just anybody willing to compensate him for this. Now, I'm sure he gets all kind of kickbacks and tax write-offs and all kind of perks for being on the right side of this, but his frustrations are mounting. Of course, he is part of the elite class, but he's always been one of the more rogue members of the elite. He could probably be whipped into shape if need be, but a lot of it does come from ego, where he's willing to buck these trends, where he's willing to come out there and say something off the wall before quickly disappearing from the public eye for the next several months. And that on top of the Twitter deal, which of course Twitter is a platform that it facilitates a lot of public discourse, a disproportionate amount of public discourse compared to its size and user base. We'll put it that way. But more importantly, on the Starlink, he is threatening to pull that out, and he had pointed out, and of course this could just be hot air on his side, that all the other satellite internet systems either are not equipped for this or have figured out that the challenge was beyond their means in order to provide the uplink for Ukraine to keep its internet online, to keep its logistical service online via that internet, because they referenced, I think HughesNet's the other big satellite internet company, but he was going through and saying that, yeah, these companies, they aren't equipped for it. Starlink is the only company in the world that is equipped for it, and I'm tired of being taken for a free ride. And that's actually echoing a lot of the rhetoric that you get out of, funny enough, somewhere like Bulgaria, who they've been saying that about their arms donations, and a lot of your other European countries, where within the first few months, people thought Russia could be dislodged if we just put enough support behind Ukraine, gave them what they need. so they could kick Russia in the teeth a bit and force them to withdraw. But now, not only is that still the goal, you're getting these delusions of grandeur, especially from people like John Bolton, where they want this war to go so poorly for Russia that it forces a regime change inside the Kremlin. Now, I think they all know, but they seem to have this naive optimism that it will be somebody conciliatory towards the West, somebody who will make those concessions, not somebody who would go harder with this war. But they want to make this war as painful for Russia as possible, which I imagine when they talked in people like Musk or whoever else, or some of these smaller Eastern European countries into it initially, they probably said, oh, it's going to be a few months, maybe close to Europe most of this, and that they had not signed up for this long game. While they may be supportive of the Ukrainian cause in the abstract, once pen is put to paper, and once they just keep pushing their luck further and further, they start to get second thoughts. Now, am I under any impression that Elon Musk is going to come out and become part of the quote unquote distant right or any of these other things? No. But there is a very real possibility that just from his self interest, from his bottom line, keep in mind this is the same guy who refused to flip the off switch for all the Teslas in Russia, which apparently he does have the capability to do with these electric cars. But he is a bit more pragmatic. He is a bit more willing to look out for his bottom line and not willing to throw away everything he spent his entire life building up in order to stick it to Ukraine's ethnic rivals.
Yeah, billboards of Musk are being taken down. He's considered an enemy, and he's now on the list. I saw this on his Twitter feed. He's asking. He had never heard of Mitro Dvorets, which is like this Ukrainian kill list, and several. Of course, Darina Dugina was killed, but through the years, various journalists have been killed. And so he's on this kill list, as is Scott Ritter, and I believe Colonel McGregor. And he's asking, is like, is this for real? And then the replies are like, oh, it's probably not real. And then somebody else replies and says, well, I mean, there's crazies everywhere, so like it could be real. I don't know. Anyhow, of course, it is real. Um, the Yukis are not going to go for it, I don't think, because that would be just they would shoot themselves in the foot if they did. Um, yeah, so I don't think anything is going to come of it. When he gets his money, um, he'll toe the line. That's all.
Yes, just at the very least, it does seem, and as we saw with those couple days, that those couple days can be crucial when it comes to these sort of operations. That when these sort of systems go down, even just temporarily, that your entire mission is in danger. That it becomes a dire situation. So perhaps through hardballing, Musk can, and not even that he has the intention of helping the Russian effort, but perhaps through his hardballing, he can indirectly assist with that, and that could buy the Russian side some time to capitalize on that. Now, whether they will or not is anyone's question, is anyone's guess. But it is interesting to see this back and forth, and that him and a few others are willing to be a bit more transgressive on this. You even have Jeffrey Sachs, who was the man responsible for rebuilding the post-Soviet Russian economy, saying that we can't win this war without negotiation. And again, you'll find a few elites here and there, even within the United States, who will come out and say these and hint at these sort of things and give that sort of pressure valve, I'll call it, that isn't just complete jingoism, that isn't just complete charge into war and give Russia the bloody nose that deserves, blah, 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 blah. But maybe there's a more sensible approach to this conflict. And like I said, I have some European news about that. But if you have any last minute Ukrainian items, you can
Y-
go ahead.
yeah, I do actually. So there have been several terrorist attacks that have been thwarted in Russia. Uh, a guy with a manpad was discovered of partial Ukrainian descent outside of Moscow. I'm presuming this is somewhere close to one of the three airports around Moscow. Some people are speculating that maybe the reason he was caught so quickly is because the Americans tipped off the Russians. I don't know. It's kind of like people speculating that it was Musk that turned off Starlink, but now, the same day that happened, like even before that was made news, I saw that Russia had put into the front lines this kind of scrambling system that up until now they haven't used. I'm presuming they didn't want to use it because, well, I mean, it's the same reason why America doesn't want to give Ukraine like its best weapons, or why America wants um, Musk to use Starlink, because they don't want the Russians to learn about what kind of war material they have up their sleeve, what kind of technology is in their possession, right? So I'll say that. Now, the other two items I have for Russia is there are now 12 suspects that are related to the bombing or the terrorist attack on the Kerch Bridge. Eight have been arrested. Most of the ethnicities are Russian, but there are, I believe, one Ukrainian, but there are also there's an Armenian there as well. Um, and Erdogan and Putin have been saying that they discovered and have detained over a dozen suspects who were planning to blow up the Turk Stream pipeline. I have no doubt that, like, I think this is true. If it's not true, it will be true. Um, I think there's so much on the line for the U.S. right now. It only understands escalation. I think, we talked about Macron saying that if Russia used nuclear weapons in Ukraine, France isn't going to use nuclear weapons. But people forget Burrell said that first. All he said is, "We'll annihilate the Russian army if they did that, but we won't use nuclear weapons to do it." Whatever. Um, Last week again, I was saying, like, America has its off ramp. We'll get into the European use and why that's so. Um, and we have to be cognizant that there are the midterms. They are like 3 weeks away, and we'll have to monitor how things go after the elections. But I just have that nagging feeling, and I said it just right after the war started, that, like, can America back down from this? And I don't think it can. Um, this is, in my opinion, this is even more important to America than Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely, especially in light of the loss in Afghanistan. And even
Yeah.
if we still had some contingencies of however many couple thousand troops in Afghanistan at Bagram, it would still be the same stakes more or less, but there is the reputational loss of how the withdrawal was conducted, so they're willing to pour everything into this. You brought up the story about Turkstream and how they detained plotters who were plotting the demolition of Turkstream. And the day after the Nord Stream demolitions, you'll recall that Hungarian officials came out and said that they were doing everything in their power to strengthen security around Turkstream. So that was always suspected to be the next target, especially because of Turkey and Hungary, both of which are renegade nations in NATO, for lack of a better term, and that it directly supplies energy to both of them. Whereas Germany, although they have been cooperative with the Russians over the past several years, are a much more compliant state in NATO and much more compliant to the American empire. But you had also mentioned some of the comments that Macron has made. Macron has been returning to almost a form that we saw him under Trump. Now, there was the statement where he echoed Borrell, where he said that they would not respond with nuclear weapons even if Russia did deploy them first. He spoke out against a law passed by the Ukrainian legislature that forbade negotiation with Russia, and his response to that is they'll simply have to, that this law is just pie in the sky idealism, that there's nothing they can really do legally that can prevent any sort of negotiations. And you have seen that push for negotiations. And even Macron had threatened to give Putin a phone call. Now,
Uh,
those of you who have kept up just with geopolitics over the past few years know that the Putin and Macron phone calls are a semi-frequent thing. Sometimes they're much more cordial than others, but recently, it's been a bit of a strange tone because Macron, France, they have been fully supportive of the Ukrainian cause thus far in the war, but it does seem as we draw close to winter, and with fuel shortages and civil unrest in France, that the idea of negotiation sounds much more palatable all of a sudden. And you even had Ben Wallace, the one of the former British ministers of defense, and I actually believe he does currently hold the position, but he's also held it in the past, just a mainstay within the British military establishment, was condemning Macron for his statements about the nuclear weapons, and he was saying that he's shattering the West's united front against Ukraine. So you have the NATO unity that has never been stronger. The West has never been more united on any other cause. And then to add to that pressure, you have Hungary, which is no surprise, said that this war can only be ended through negotiations. And then you also had Romania coming out with an almost identical statement within a few days of the Hungarian statement. And these sentiments are growing more and more popular. I can imagine as winter rolls in, the only places that will really hold out on these kind of statements will be places like Poland and the Baltic states, the countries with a real vested ethnic interest in this conflict who have a score they feel they need to settle, as opposed to Romania and Hungary. Although they do have their contentious history with Russia and the Soviet Union, it's not as much as a long-standing rivalry as, say, a Pole or Lithuanian or a Latvian or anyone from that that stretch of northeastern Europe may have. So it does appear, and we'll see how things go after November with the midterms within the United States and the rhetoric that comes out of the United States going into winter, and how difficult this winter actually is for the Europeans before we can really comment on that further. But there is a growing nervousness in Europe due to all of this. And I would say that also comes from a lot of what is coming out of Germany right now, where we had mentioned last week that a lot of industry was fleeing from German shores because they simply can't continue operation there. A lot of chemical plants were moving to China. Well, it turns out after a tax incentive, you have chemical plants that will also be relocating to the United States as well. So, on top of a policy that deprived Europe of energy and then deprived them of even the means to get energy if this crisis is resolved, you have the American state pillaging industry from Europe now. Because it
yeah.
wasn't enough to cut them off from Nord Stream, wasn't enough to put them on an adversarial footing with Russia. Not that Europeans would all be Russophiles if it wasn't for America, but they would have a much more pragmatic approach towards it. You even had Merkel coming out and saying that my my diplomatic work has been completely squandered within the past 6 months. But on top of that, you have stripping of one of Germany's largest industries, the chemical industry, either going to the US or going to China. And I can almost guarantee you the elements that are going to China are going to, let's just say, the much more chimeric elements of China rather than, say, the Xi Jinping faction. Because there still is a little bit of factionalism in China. I, I can get into that at another time. It's not particularly relevant, but although you've had the solidifying of control under somebody like Xi Jinping, there are still all those chimerica factors in there, and they get used very well. And people do fear that they will be used as an avenue for Chinese sanctions on Russia. But again, time will tell with that, and we can get into that either later in the show with some of our China news or at a different time altogether because it's not too relevant to what I have here right now. But just continuing on with some of the European news. As I had mentioned before, the civil unrest in France is actually turning violent once again because You have fuel rationing being implemented. You have a lot of fuel stations that are undersupplied, if not completely out, and people, of course, are taking to the streets. They are being met with police force. And you have Russia, who is trying to discuss with diplomats from Germany, Denmark, and Sweden over the Nord Stream incident because last week they did come out and say we believe Nord Stream 2 might be repairable. Now, I think that was more of a prod, more of a jab at them than any actual serious analysis. But there is this attempt at trying to figure out the situation. And once again, Russia defaulting to diplomacy, even in the case of an outright war, which is something that does tend to happen again and again, something that people have criticized Putin for. And let's
I
see.
mean, really, what he's trying to do is by making that offer publicly, he's basically allowing themselves to dig in a hole. And some of the developments that happened today and yesterday is Sweden no longer wants to participate in a joint effort with Germany and Denmark in solving what happened. And so now there won't be any joint investigation. All three countries will be investigating it, each of them uh, individually. And by basically him saying, well, one of the two pipelines of Nord Stream 2 is functional. Of course, they're going to say no, right? Meaning, well, if it's not America, then it's probably America and some accomplices, including the countries who are investigating right now, that don't want this pipeline, and it's not Russia.
Oh, absolutely. And then just to continue on some European news, on top of the protests and the outcry against fuel shortages, you have anti NATO protests cropping up in France once again. Now, these certainly won't be enough to move the needle even the slightest, but it does show between the protests in France, between the protests in the Czech Republic, and these protests that you get across Europe every few weeks, that there is public discontent towards these policies. Now, once again, they don't really have the power base in order to take over and reverse these policies, but as material conditions get worse, as social conditions get worse, you will see these groups as a much more active front in their respective countries. Remember how big the Yellow Vests got when they were at their height. Now, ultimately, they didn't affect any change except extracting a few concessions from Macron, but combine that with much more social and economic pressure, it's really anyone's game at that point. There is a funny statement that Burrell had put out, which is almost a moment of self-awareness, that he said, quote, our prosperity was based on cheap energy from Russia. You have Germany with demands from their unions for a 10.5% wage increase due to the inflation numbers. And finally, last couple economic news out of Europe is that energy crisis has caused European car output to be down projected 40%. So, I mean, Europe, especially Germany, France, Italy, these are all nations with very large auto industries. And that's looking at, and not only large domestic auto industries, but I'm talking about global auto industries, especially German cars. Once again, they're all over the place. It's one of those things. Maybe not so much French cars, Italian cars. Maybe on like a bit more prestigious level, they're on an international level. But especially when it comes to the German auto industry, in terms of being like a staple of the global car industry, they're up there with the Japanese and the Americans at that point. So you have that, and then there is some economic concern out of the Bank of England that with the quarter ending, that they were telling the pension funds that they have 3 days left, more or less, and it again that's getting into the ongoing pension crisis, which has been bubbling under the surface for years, but we could finally see that come to a head in 2023, 2024. I doubt it'll be in this year because things seem to be stable and we seem to only be at the beginning of such a crisis. But the economic issues with Europe are coming to a head, and they're going to be coming to a head hard in the next few months and over the course of the next year here. And finally, we do have a migrant caravan building up on the Greek Turkish border. Now, with that, it is a repeat of what we saw in 2019, 2018, 2020, even somewhat in 2021. Now, the 2020 crisis was quickly averted, but this is one of the larger caravans that we have seen in the past
It's a
couple.
million people.
Yeah, it's about a million people. It's one of the larger ones we've seen in the past couple of years. And Erdogan has a great upper hand right now. He's coming out of a slump of unpopularity within these past few months. These past over the course of this past year, with some concerns about inflation in Turkey and their economic situation. But with the withdrawals from Syria, with some of the nationalists prodding against Turkey and other surrounding nations and the situation in Armenia, he is enjoying a bit of a boost in popularity, a bit of a boost in legitimacy. And he's once again threatening to unleash a caravan onto Europe. This is on top of recent negotiations he has had with Russia. This is the same formula we've seen play out time and time again in some way, shape, or form, except given the situation in Europe and given the situation with Russia and how much higher the stakes are, this situation has all the more weight. I will say what I had said last time for this, and this is usually how it turns out. Greece, Bulgaria, Cyprus, whoever, Turkey may be threatening at the time, will be leaned on to give the Turks the concessions that they want. And
Yeah.
because at this point, in Washington, they don't want to do anything that is going to provoke Turkey. They don't want to do anything that is going to push them even closer to Russia than they already are, because it's already a delicate balance. And over the past 2 years, I would say, we've seen Turkey go from the wild card, and still very much is a wild card, but it's leaning more and more on the Russian side as time goes on. And there was that brief dispute between the French, Russians, and the Turks regarding Libya. That didn't really seem to go anywhere. Of course, there are still the disputes between Russia and Turkey regarding the Caucasus and the questions around Armenia and Azerbaijan. And there also is early on in the war, now this is somewhat tapered, that Turkey was providing the Ukraine their own kamikaze drones. And you'll recall Turkey has been a real pioneer in the kamikaze drones since the days of the war in Syria. And I mean they were the ones who actually inspired the Iranians to get in on the industry. They're
Mhm.
the innovators when it comes to this. So it's
And
as
the Yemenis.
yes,
Well, I mean, you're right. They're getting it from Iran. So
yes.
yeah,
Uh,
they're developing some of it on their own, but Iran is a major player now.
Well, I mean, I would say that Turkey was the pioneer, and then
Yeah,
Iran
definitely.
adopted and surpassed them, if I had to put it that way. But they, in my opinion, are the ones who showed that this could be a method used in warfare, and it's become once again that very fragile balance right now, where Washington has to be very, very careful with how it treats Turkey, because although things have been contentious,
Yes.
there's still a lot they can get out of it, even in this sort of middle position they find themselves in. And they isolate Turkey, they push it towards Russia. That's the end of NATO. And they play their cards wrong and give Turkey too many concessions. The smaller countries of NATO, plus any patrons they may have, for example, France throughout 2019, 2020, really tried to portray itself as the shield of these Balkan nations, whether that be Greece, whether that be Bulgaria. The first ones to send support to Greece in terms of this border crisis in 2020. Again, that's also a formula for the end of NATO. And as we were discussing before the show, they have to play this very, very, very delicately, because an implosion of NATO is going to be too reminiscent of the Soviet Union, of the Warsaw Pact, which is a
Yeah.
complete collapse in legitimacy. They'll do what they can. They'll loosen the chains. They'll loosen their grip on the leash to allow NATO a bit more internal autonomy, to let these countries have a bit more leeway in terms of their internal actions, while still ultimately answering to Washington nonetheless, which is also a dangerous game, because you could get a country that becomes far too renegade. So it really is, while they do have short-term solutions, and while short-term they may make it seem like they're managing this crisis very well, because they are able to still convince the vast majority of people that NATO has never been more united, and even on surface level evidence, NATO has never been more united. But once again, it is a very delicate situation where if the apparatus out of Washington or even Brussels reacts the wrong way to one of Erdogan's boisterous moves, it could be the unraveling of the entire system.
Right. I think if you wanted like a sign for when you're going to see this, I mean, Turkey is already a sign of the deterioration of NATO to begin with, right? Um, but if you wanted a more clear-cut sign of more autonomy given to each NATO country, I suppose what would preclude that would be some kind of a clause that affected the Article 5 of NATO. Uh, I would see something like that, or it would be maybe like a quote unquote unforeseen event where Article 5 should be called but is waived. This would be the perfect war for something like that to happen. But I think rather than lose face, maybe America would be willing, because it could be advantageous for America, right? To have some statutes and limitations on Article 5, and therefore granting greater autonomy to, say, countries like Poland, for instance, right? Now, it's dangerous with Russia there, but let's say this war goes on for another 3-4 years. Well, Russia will be less dangerous, and that could be in its advantage, right? To um, give each of these some of these countries more autonomy. Uh, this has to be pitched the right way for this to work. Where optically, for the public, as you put it, it would not look like a disaster, and it could be spun as, look, America doesn't control all of this, right? So it could. That's the way it would have to be spun. But I did find, actually, just to go back to the war in Ukraine one last time. I did find information about the people who have been caught. Apparently, according to the Russians, the guy who set this up is the GUR of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, and it's 5 Russian citizens and 3 Ukrainian citizens and an Armenian that have been detained.
Yeah, that sounds about the kind of mix you'd expect from a sabotage operation originating inside of Russia. Now, if you told me this 100 years ago, that would just sound like that would just sound like a a Bolshevik shock troop squadron. Just that ethnic makeup right there. But I suppose history may not repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. But
Hmm.
yeah, that's not to my shock at all. But yes, as you were saying with NATO, that it is a very fine line that they do have to walk, but it also is a very beneficial one where they can seemingly alleviate, where Washington can seemingly alleviate itself from these responsibilities by saying, well, look, there's more strategic autonomy for the various countries in NATO. They have a say in this too. Not everything that happens is because of us, blah, blah, blah. And, just because they do something isn't necessarily because we told them to. These are sovereign countries, and look, we have their back and we may be directing their decisions, but these are certainly sovereign countries. So, but yeah, once again, you walk that tightrope where you get countries that get too renegade or countries that put the entire operation at risk. For example, Poland with much more strategic autonomy would be more of a liability for NATO than it already is now because once again, and if the biggest Article 5 risk in NATO is Poland because of their position towards Russia and the possibility that just the way they posture themselves, they may provoke a Russian attack. And that has been something that arguably some elements in NATO, some people have wanted. They have wanted to go take the accelerationist route where they get Poland to provoke Russia into an attack so they can justify a larger response. But yeah, that's the kind of thing you risk, and it would certainly have to be a redressing of Article 5 if you gave these countries more strategic autonomy, because you can't make that kind of broad defense commitment because they know well that's what starts these kind of major wars. Now, they'll try to appeal to the mythology of World War II, but at the end of the day, they're going to be stuck with the reality of World War II. A defense guarantee you signed that you really have no way of upholding except through all out war on a massively destructive scale, which is something, although as much as they invoke the World War II mythology, as much as they like to think themselves as Churchill or whoever, they simply don't want another Poland 1939 situation on their hands, and they're already more than dissatisfied with the current situation in Ukraine.
Yes. I mean, you have so many crazy developments in the last 6 days where it's obvious now, I think, to like, I don't know, people with like an IQ over 100. But maybe it's the bell curve that explains it. I don't know. But you have Sachs, who was one of the one of the guys that was responsible for the diluting of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's on air with one of the big American TV stations and saying, "Well, yeah, of course America did it." Right. And so we know, like, the EU is controlled by the US, NATO is controlled by the US, the UN is more or less controlled by the US. Um, and it has to, because it's reserve currency is what matters. If that goes, it goes. So it would be a huge collapse. And I think this kind of gradual loosening up, uh, but at the same time, convincing these countries who've been given greater autonomy that America has their back. We'll see how long it can go, because let's say um, Poland can enter the fray in Ukraine, and there's a clause that moderates Article 5, and America then starts supplying weapons to Poland, which has an army that's sort of been untouched and has more modern weapons
And
than
probably far more competent leadership than the Ukrainians at that.
it's possible, yeah. Um,
Not that that's a very high bar, let me just put it that way.
right. Like, how far can this go? Um, I think we're going to find out by February or March next year.
Yeah, that sounds about the right time frame, especially as you come out of winter and things start to warm up and Europe is less kneecapped by its energy situation where it requires less energy, that come February, March, and I would argue even April, we can really see how the situation will play out, who's willing to do what kind of effect winter 2022 2023 had on not only Ukraine but Europe as a whole. So a lot of it is just factors that we simply have no way to speculate on without this prerequisite information.
Yeah, I mean, France made a statement yesterday saying it will not have enough electricity for the entire winter. Right? Um, there was a German representative on German television today that said, you don't have to look at what's coming with such a sense of bleak tragedy. What was the word that he used? Some, old jumper, like some thermals, and then you put another layer of thermals, and you'll be fine. Um, like one or two winters of that, and we said this off air. What has most people up in arms right now is cost of living is just too high. Uh, for instance, all the Baltic states, not on the industrial level, but on the economic level, are all over 22% in inflation. The U.S. inflation has gone up,
Look, I
not
know
by a
you can't
lot,
make a
but
one for one comparison, but Germany in particular, as well as Europe as a whole, what is happening with the energy crisis right now is very reminiscent of Ceausescu's Romania within the last years, where he was condemned to hell and back, and I would even say rightfully so, because of his energy policy, because of his policy of cutting heat in the winter in order to balance the Romanian budget. And that was on top of mounting economic crises in the Eastern Bloc. But point being is,
Mhm.
these things that drove Romania to put him on a public trial and public execution are the same conditions that we're seeing play out in Europe right now.
Yeah, and then you contrast that with like, I saw a Bloomberg report where like Russia is not in a recession. It is climbing out. They have reduced their debt by $45.5 billion this year. There's an extra 8 billion that has been that has been put in. So um, unemployment is at 3.8%, the lowest since '91. Uh, So it's not, um, I would say on the economic front, Russia has really done well. And I think after the referendums, as you say, are all over, and you have something like 35 countries abstaining um, from condemning Russia, 5 countries voting against the condemnation. Um, particularly India and China abstaining, but there were other countries like Thailand, for instance, and so, a few others that I remember who abstained. Basically, you have over half the global population. Like they want, they want to see America go down. They are honestly fed up. I think a lot of them. I don't want to over personalize it because some of these countries, for instance, particularly in Africa, they're looking for help all the time. And Chrystia Freeland, our foreign minister, you know, she was asked by an African, like, you know, we're not getting any aid because the aid is going to Ukraine, and Russia is there knocking on the door, and I don't know how much longer we can avoid um, making a deal with them. And I mean, this has been the story kind of the last 20 years, except it's been up until the last few years, it's been China making these deals,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was just about to bring up, and we had
Hmm.
brought this up on the show before that when a Western power shows up, you get a lecture and they go home. When China shows up, at least they build some sort of piece of key infrastructure. And
Like
then,
hospitals.
yeah, it was on Twitter, and it's like, well, do you really think that's free? And it's like you're giving him the lecture, and somebody actually had pointed that out. And we had this discussion about,
Well, that's what Freeland said. She said, "Well, democracy is something we all have to fight for. We can't make you fight for democracy." Like, what is she saying? She's saying, like, you really like. Like, you're drunk on this shit, right? Africa has to think about how to survive. Uh, they don't give a shit about your stupid democracy. Even the guys in the upper IQ echelon who've studied at your universities know the reality on the ground, right? Like it's just she literally gave him a lecture, as you say.
yeah, and at that point, we've had these discussions about neocolonialism, and the only European or Western country I'd say that has come close to coherent model, which we've already seen in this fall part, is France, because all the money that they put in those sort of projects has once again gone to Ukraine. But you actually have an effort on the part of Russia and China to build these infrastructure projects. Now, they're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. It's certainly profitable for them, and they certainly get to reap the benefits of a lot of this, as they should. They're the ones building it, in my personal opinion. But at that point, yeah, you have the powers that are willing to do this, that are willing to cede their influence there, and willing to put in the investments and frankly get the payoff. And then you have the countries that in the West are willing to throw aid into just these one or more or less embezzlement funds, say they're doing humanitarian work, and then pack him going home, and then the minute a conflict breaks out in Europe, they're going to yank all that money that never really did its intended well, I shouldn't even say intended purpose, never really did what its publicly stated purpose was in the first place, and put it into yet another money laundering scheme in Ukraine. So at that point, you're not going to garner the goodwill of these African countries and have them condemn this invasion of a sovereign state or whatever moral grandstanding they like to get on about, because at that point it just comes down to self-interest for them. Look at the
Yeah.
countries that are actually investing them versus the countries that aren't. Now, again, maybe you could argue if we still live in the era of I mean, if we live in the era of colonialism, it's not like these countries would have really any say on the international stage. Not that they really have much anyway. But point being is, it's once again just sour grapes that Russia and China are doing what you used to do and have the influence that you used to have because you let yourself have that stripped away from you, or
Hmm.
is forcibly stripped away from you. But you know what? I like, for example, you have the gradual decolonization of France and the UK as they banned it. But and look at Portugal. Portugal held on to their colonies until the absolutely last minute that they could. So you got to at least commend them for that. But I mean, look, we're retreading old ground here. I've gone on this rant before, but it gets
Hmm.
down to that point where the West, while it is the global economic engine of the world, and while it certainly is the most powerful power block in the world, its influence isn't nearly as hegemonic as they would like you to believe, or even as it once was.
Well, yeah, I mean, all you have to do is look at the developments between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. this week. Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned last time, is going to decrease production of oil, and it's going to do this in conjunction with Russia.
And that's
Uh,
after the Biden begging phone call
yeah,
asking OPEC and Saudi Arabia, well, can you not cut production? No, he's not concerned about them cutting production at all. But just wait until after the midterms. Wait until I get through my electoral hurdle before you cut the
yes,
production.
that's right, that's right, that's right, that's right. It's impeachable, but of course, it doesn't matter. It's whom. So uh, you can see that in many ways, countries even like Saudi Arabia, as this war has developed, uh, they can smell the blood in the water, and this is their chance right now to break free from the U.S. The U.S. has made statements, including today, saying that they are not going to ship any more arms to Saudi Arabia. I wonder who is going to fill that role then? Who's going
Perhaps the
to
largest
start
arms
supplying?
manufacturer in the world.
Yeah, right. And as long as Saudi Arabia is moving closer with Iran, because there's a potential for a conflict here, that if Russia takes this spot, right, that'll create a conflict with Iran. Now, that's not good because this week, Russia is going to develop five different oil and gas fields within Iran. The relationship between Russia and Iran is extremely good right now. If they could come up with a political solution to Yemen, right? Uh, America would not be needed there, right? Um,
Oh, I'm glad you
I
brought that
think
up. You have these flailing attempts to revive the JCPOA, which is long dead. It's dead the minute Trump pulled out of it. But
I know.
you have even like throughout the beginning of this year, and it's funny enough they were actually initiated by Biden. These reconciliation talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Well, lo and behold, look who's there making deals with Saudi Arabia. Look who's there developing oil and gas fields in Iran. It's Russia. If there's any country that can really facilitate an agreement between the two, it's going to be Russia and maybe to a lesser extent China. Countries
Yeah,
that have actually vested interest in both. And it goes back once again to the testament of failure of American foreign policy. Say
we might
when
even see China offering, military supplies. We don't know, right? That could
oh
be a
yeah.
way out to keep the relationship between Russia and Iran going. Like again, if they can figure out a political solution, I'm sorry to interrupt. Like this could be a really big problem because, um, one of the reasons America is not winning in the global South and in the Middle East is because it just doesn't have anything to offer,
Oh
and
yeah, and
it's yet another war, and everybody else is making business.
I was actually just about to bring that up because I had brought up the JCPOA. I'd brought up Trump completely scrapping the deal. Barack Obama, where you can't really point to really anything positive he did, and I've said this for years. There's exactly two items I can give him credit on.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
is the 2014 energy boom, when the U.S. energy industry skyrocketed, thanks to him actually allowing it to happen. And number two is the JCPOA. Because from the interest, and at that point, I had much more faith that America could still be a functional country with global relevance at that point. That is all but dissipated, but that's a topic for a different day. You had the process of reconciliation between the United States and Iran. Now, the Gulf states weren't happy. Israel was furious. But at least in the Gulf states, you had some process of that could have been the beginning of reconciliation. And you would have had in that position where Iran and Saudi Arabia are sort of mutually kept at bay by a greater power that gets to reap the benefits of a relationship with both. Well, now that Trump pulled out the JCPOA on behalf of his Zionist handlers, and certainly that wasn't the only reason, but that was the primary reason, you have Russia coming in to fill that void and to be the power that keeps those two at bay. And look, despite some of the setbacks in Ukraine, and again, you've just heard our entire hour long report we just did on Ukraine, the amount of influence globally Russia has gained at the cost of what it has lost, it is by far a net gain with what they have. Because, look, while Europe is an important market, while it has a lot of wealth to offer,
It won't
it,
be for long.
yeah, and number one, it won't be for long. Number two, in terms of geopolitical relevance and really where power is around the globe, it's a much better deal to have the Middle East in your back pocket. And I remember even going all the way back to 2016, 2017, 2018, you had like outlets like the Atlantic, Washington Post, all these Western media rags running these articles saying, is Vladimir Putin the new kingmaker of the Middle East? And this was on the topic of negotiations in Russia and Syria. I mean, but realistically, whether it's Putin himself, whether it's Lavrov, or just the Russian diplomatic apparatus as a whole, they've played their cards extremely well in the Middle East, from intervention into Syria, from negotiations with Turkey, to keeping, once again, a very balanced line with Israel, not supporting all these annexations of the West Bank territory, but also not taking the complete must be driven into the sea, Palestine must be free sort of rhetoric, even though, look, Frank,
But we'll let Hamas train with Spetsnaz.
yeah, yes. Even though I have to say I wouldn't be too deeply upset if that happened, of course. But of course I condone no violence. Israel is our greatest ally, after all. To once, as we've seen recently, deals with the Gulf states, it was able to pacify a situation that was started almost solely by the United States in 2003. Because look, they could have gotten away with Afghanistan, they could have gotten away with a little excursion there, but the minute they took out Saddam Hussein, they threw the entire region into just what seemed at the time an unsolvable situation, into a into a balance of power that is completely lopsided. In fact, the exact opposite of a balance of power. And then you have the interventions in Syria, and you have all the things I just mentioned that has finally pacified the Middle East to the point where it's probably the most peaceful we've seen it since. I don't even know what, since before the Iran-Iraq war. And I know that's a bit of a stretch, and I still have a lot of fighting in Syria going on. I know you still have the entire debacle in Yemen going on. But compared to what's been going on since 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and with the Iraqi invasion of Iran, I would say things are the most pacified they've been in that region since then.
Yeah, it's not saying a lot, but
Yeah, yeah, well,
yeah,
yeah,
I
it is a
mean,
low bar, but you know.
yeah, I mean, it's not Iraq, let's say between 2003 to 2012, you know. Um, but it's in complete disarray. I didn't know if you wanted to get into some Syrian news, but things are heating up there. But it's up to you. I mean, it's Afrin has fallen to HTS.
Yeah,
That's a
I didn't plan on getting into too much of that, and I plan to letting the situation play out a bit. But once
Yeah.
again,
Okay, we can leave it till next
yeah,
week.
I'll just put it this way: the various opposition infighting has completely flared up, especially upon we're about a month and a half, 5 weeks or so since the deal between Turkey and Syria was announced. So you're seeing the fallout of that actually starting to take place. But I do believe that situation needs a bit more time to develop before we dive too far
Hmm.
into it, but the last piece of Middle Eastern news I have, which is something you briefly mentioned earlier, is the energy deal between Turkey and Russia. And let me just read off some of the points of that deal we have here. So, uh, Putin and Erdogan had a meeting, and just the general points of that is that Turkey has gotten its gas supplies, and it's proven to be the most reliable partner in recent years. Turk Stream is still online. The saboteurs were apprehended. Communication is high and consistent, and it's looking at this way if there is the willingness of the Turkish side to invest in another pipeline project, that Turkey could be a proper energy hub of the region. So, as we were discussing earlier, with that very delicate game Washington has to play with the Turkish situation, you have Russia further increasing its influence there via energy. The most one of the most powerful resources Russia has is actual energy trade, something far more material than just the financial power the U.S. can offer. Now, don't get me wrong; that financial power does go a long way, but after a certain point, the tangible energy resources, you can actually see them at the end of the day. Let's just put it that way. So, you have this massive breakthrough in cooperation between Russia and Turkey for the time being, and that's on top of all the other things we had just listed with all the progress they had made in the Middle East thus far. So, yeah, at that point, it is once again since 2003, since the invasion of Iraq. Now, I think it might be a bit reductionist to contribute everything to that, but I think you contribute the vast majority of it to that. American influence in the Middle East completely dissipated, just consistently more and more every year. I can only imagine what 2023 will hold, especially with these new Saudi Russia deals and the Gulf states becoming more conciliatory towards Russia, because at this point, I mean, look, I would say over the next 18 months or so, and that's probably even a bit of a large window, 12 to 18 months, you're going to see one big attempt by the US, by the UK, by the Western Bloc in general, in order to get their guys back in power in Saudi Arabia, in order to get a more pliant candidate than Mohammed bin Salman in charge, or effectively in charge of the country. So it's really going to come down to that. But at this point, all the influence that America had spent either building or destroying, depending on your point of view in the Middle East, has completely dissipated. Even Israel is not the reliable partner it once was, and we all know the nuances of the American-Israeli relationship. But aren't even they aren't the steadfast. I mean, you've even seen the pro-Israel rhetoric from the Republican Party be sidelined. Now, it hasn't been retracted, it hasn't been contradicted, but it's not something people too actively bring up anymore. And that could just be because of how contentious the situation is with Ukraine, that the Middle East is on the back of everyone's mind. But once again, you don't hear too much about Israel's wants and needs anymore. And really, they aren't looking at the United States as their only guarantor anymore. Now, perhaps they looked at Russia before the war, before you had some of the events with a lot of the Jewish exodus from Russia back to Israel. But point being is, they're keeping their eyes open. They've made these economic deals with China over the years. I don't know how the relationship with China will go. There's much more of a cultural and historical separation between China and the Jewish people than there is, say, for example, Russia, the U.S., Europeans, etc., or even getting that point, their other Middle Eastern neighbors. There's much more of a they're much more alien cultures to each other, which in that kind of case can actually be helpful because there's less history to draw on, there's less animus to be had. But yeah, it does show that they are looking outside of the box. I mean, even hell, even to a country like Brazil, you'll recall how much money and time they put into courting Bolsonaro, who also
Hmm.
will be entering into, I believe it's October 23rd is the second round of the elections against Lula, because although he did come out in first place of the first round, he didn't secure the majority of the votes. So Brazilian elections are still on the table, but you see how they're experimenting with these other secondary powers in terms of guarantors, in terms of people who they can extract several billions of dollars a year from. But yeah, just overseeing the complete like dissolution of American influence in the Middle East is it's mind-boggling, and it does make you wonder how much longer, like even a country like say, Kuwait. Now, I know Kuwait has been less influential on this, but all those Gulf states, like a few exceptions aside, maybe like a Qatar, all more or less proxies of Saudi Arabia. So it does make you wonder. I don't think they'll outright expel troops, but it does make you wonder the viability of the physical American presence in those countries long term.
hmm you brought up China. I just want to briefly mention that China is in the middle of a process of building 300 new ICBM missile silos. These are like intercontinental missile silos. And they're building them close to the Russian border. Now, it's going to sound counterintuitive, but that's because they actually trust Russia. The reason being is this gives them a few hours' time to prepare a launch had they been placed further along the shores of China, along the China Sea.
Yeah, placing
Uh,
them close to the Russian border sounds like more of a response for integration than hostility.
right, right. There's not going to be like I just think it's so funny over the last 2 years how so many people in the dissident right got China and Russia completely wrong. Like not just for 1 year, but for like 2 years or and more now. Um, so, anyways, um, but that's all I have to say about China. The big crunch that's going to happen there is America has put sanctions on the export of various microchips that the Chinese produce, and I think one of the reasons people speculate why China isn't going to invade Taiwan is because it doesn't want to lose access to chip manufacturing. But I think it's entirely possible that maybe it will be able to produce like it does produce chips already, right? And it produces chips for its own military, but um, will it be able to go to the next level? We'll see. So far, um, it's proven that it can for military use, anyways. It's quite good. And if anything, what the war in Ukraine has taught us is that a $22,000 drone can take out a $2 million MiG, right? So you could have all kinds of systems that are, scrambling to deal with low tech.
You
So
know, I'm loving the new Ace Combat 8 storyline. It's really riveting stuff. but um, but yes, I agree with everything you just said, and I just have one last piece of Middle Eastern news before we get into some stuff about Asia. Is that Israel is now beginning pipeline tests itself. You'll recall in
mm,
2019 they wanted that joint energy project that they had cooperation from Cyprus, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, uh, Greece, and some other southern European countries as well, like along that Adriatic and Mediterranean coast, where they were considering building a pipeline. But that project was quickly sidelined. But as the energy crunch becomes greater and greater, that may be something we see play out in real time. In which case, I'm anticipating it, and I would imagine most of you probably are as well. So that will be interesting to see if they can actually break ground on that pipeline and they don't just scrap the project again. Turkey will once again be that big factor because they were also the factor that did scuttle that pipeline last time, and especially if they're considering a pipeline deal with Russia as well in regard to the recent Putin Erdogan meeting, that could put a wrench in it, but it's also, once again, would be in the character of Erdogan to accept both deals, contingent that you don't have one that wants to pull out if he accepts the other. In which case, I don't think either side would because uh, at that point, Russia wouldn't really have a reason to. It like this Israeli pipeline isn't going to make that much of a difference, and Israel and the other cooperating nations, especially in Europe, beggars can't be choosers. Let's just put it that way. So we could see a second pipeline construction project involving Turkey as well, putting it at that crossroads of civilizations once again. And that's really the crux of what we're getting out of Turkey right now. It is that crossroads of civilizations, and that is how they've been able to command such an outsized amount of power in just the past 4 years.
Yeah, it's really incredible, and in many ways, uh, Putin saw the potential of Turkey better than Erdogan did, and I think that's why the diplomacy there has worked.
Yeah, it does make you wonder what kind of internal changes you'll see in Turkey just in the past few years, because you've already seen what a lot of people have called the reverse of secularization, a much more conservative pushback against some of the more
Hmm.
liberal secular elements in the country. So it really does make you wonder what kind of direction Turkey will go in, both internally and externally, now that it isn't trying to uh, castigate itself and really bring itself down in order to get that vaunted EU membership that it wanted for so many years, in which case that's been taken completely off the table. So I do wonder, because it does seem like the Kemalist idea of the secular Republic of Turkey is losing favor in
Yeah,
favor
I
of
mean, I think that was temporary.
oh yeah.
I think a lot of that had to deal with what was Europe at that time, right? It was such a resounding victory. It was still liberalism in its youth, and it had already killed its father, which was aristocracy. And later on, it would go on to defeat, fascism and communism. And so, there was this kind of an awe moment that it can't be denied. And now we're seeing liberalism in its mature form, uh, and in its very decadent form. Scholz, the chancellor of Germany, did a video yesterday that kind of echoes the lines that you just mentioned about Turkey, and he said, Russia is fighting this war, and it considers itself like it's fighting a crusade against the degenerate West. He didn't say quite the degenerate West, but it was basically all our values and freedoms that we enjoy, our values and freedoms. Like, it's just so preposterous
Our
to listen.
European values is up there with our democracy.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so you do see the world kind of sickened with mature liberalism, middle-aged liberalism, or maybe even late middle-aged liberalism.
Midlife crisis liberalism.
I like that.
That's our episode title. It's got to be now.
Yeah, there it is. That's very good. I like that.
But that's all I had for the Middle East. And speaking of our democracy, I just have some brief news on the American midterm elections now. Those are about 3.5 weeks out. That'll be November 8th, 2022. The map for the Senate, at least, and even for the governorships, at least slightly favors the Republicans. Now, there have been speculations. There's speculation that the Democrats will have this blue wave, but that's what they say every midterm over the past, 8 years. But just news today is that on the general ballot, it puts just, again, publicly and just broadly, Republicans at 53 versus Democrats at 47. Now, you get into the nitty gritty of each individual state, that plays out differently, but it does seem a slight edge of the population. And as expected for a new president's first midterms, the opposition party is in the lead, and you probably will see that. And just given the current administration, even despite some of the fear mongering over the overturn of Roe and the abortion laws and some of the things like that, it does seem that we are in for a pretty significant Republican victory. Now, in the next few weeks, I will actually have a more coherent prediction map for you. But some of the initial thoughts that the Democrats may maintain their majority or may maintain one of the chambers of Congress, uh, I think those are very quickly being dispelled. I could see them holding the House at most, but in terms of the Senate and governorships, it's going to be a pretty healthy Republican victory, to say the least. Now, what implications that will have, both domestically and foreignly, uh, we can only tell. I imagine the foreign policy will probably continue much the same, but it could just be, once again, domestically at least, just that much more cultural division and that much more stonewalling, which maybe is exactly what needs to happen considering all things, but in terms of the social decay of America, it could just be a new facet of that, especially with the question of abortion on the ballot and the question of a lot of the LGBTQ CIA stuff, and even increasingly the immigration questions coming back into the forefront. So these midterms, I know they say this. I know every side because they need to encourage votes. The most important election of your life, but they are actually stacking up to be pretty pivotal, just because of the general state of instability within the United States as it stands. So I'm actually really interested to see the outcomes of these come November, because I think we're going to get some pretty interesting results, to say the least, when it comes to what a lot of these things have to offer. And I don't necessarily hold that Biden will be out after the midterms, but if they're going to retire him, so to speak, it's probably going to be around then. And I'm just really interested to see how this will shape the course of things going forward. Because at this point, I I really can't tell you outright, but I still do think just the more stonewalling, the better. And if we can have some degree of dissent within some chamber of government, even though it won't be that great of a degree, that will be just something, just the slightest bit more of a stopping mechanism for the American empire just going slightly too far, which I suppose that's all the Republican Party has ever been. But look, when you're in a position of more or less uncontested strength, that stopgap doesn't really do much. But as strength wanes, that concession, that stalling becomes all the more important. So I don't want to get you too optimistic about the Republican control of a chamber of the legislature, but after a certain point, when you have to give those concessions in a time when you actually have to struggle for power, we could see some interesting developments, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to them, just to see what happens, right? More of my interest is really about the kind of psychology that goes into this. You know, we'll have those leaked reports about how the Supreme Court was going to vote. Will it turn out that that's going to motivate the Democrats to go? Because, I saw some really spicy, crazy Reddit takes on what will happen if the midterms really go towards the Republicans, and then there is the election of Trump or a Republican in office. And it's just so batshit crazy. I love it. One of them was, if it happens, America will turn against Ukraine, and they will get Russia to patrol the border with Mexico.
That's
I just
I
love it.
think I know exactly the one you're talking about, and
Yeah.
yes, it is serious. It is actually the hysteria of the liberal boomer, and not just one of our
That's
guys making a joke.
uh,
I regret to inform you.
unbelievable levels of baseness. I mean, they have
Cossack
the
border
typical stuff.
patrols.
Oh, they'll outlaw gay marriage, and then they'll outlaw interracial marriage, and women will not be
Yeah.
allowed to work. They really believe a Handmaid's Tale in America is almost inevitable unless they kill all the Republicans or throw them in jail. Like it.
Yeah, yeah, Dark Brandon, let's go.
So I thought that was hilarious. But no, it will be interesting because, of course, if there is a blue wave, a lot of the grift talk on the popular right, I won't say populist right, but will have been proven wrong. And again, it'll be because um, ideology has overrun reality. I don't mean that in the typical
Or
way, and I
3M
mean it.
ballots.
That too. Um, uh, what I mean by it is this is what mature liberalism looks like, without any competitors, and that means that
Midlife
Republicans
crisis
are still
liberalism.
arguing for a younger version of liberalism that they were more comfortable with instead of this one that looks at the moment pretty invincible in the West. So that's sort of the angle that I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, that I would certainly agree with that, and it will be interesting. Again, it would take a lot of 3 a.m. ballots in a lot of places in order to get that kind of result, in my opinion. So I
Hmm.
think even they might just be running off the white flag on this one and say we'll have to deal with a bit of opposition party in power. But once again, as you said, it will just be an older version of liberalism, a much less mature version of liberalism that comes out of the Republicans. Now, there is a few renegades who are actually on significant parts of the ballot, but even their genuinity and their connections can be questioned. I'm referring particularly to just who's on my ballot. I'm thinking a lot of J.D. Vance in this case. I look, don't get me wrong, I like a lot of what he says. In fact, I voted for him in the primary. And in fact, I voted for him in early voting. I'm a bit ashamed to admit I voted, but here we are. Um, but I mean, with that again, like that comes from like sort of like the national conservatism crowd, the Peter Thiel crowd, the infamous Peter Thiel, who I certainly have my opinions on that. I will not get into for the time being, at least. But there are a few. Let's just say, although they won't be game changers, although they won't turn the entire system on its head, there are a few transgressive candidates in there. And then you have the whole Tulsi Gabbard thing, which I don't really put that much stock in. One Congress seat from Hawaii flipping to either Republican or Independent. It's really inconsequential. Now, the Gabbard has kind of a personality cult behind her and has for quite a few years now. But I mean, ultimately, it's just a PR stunt, probably for personal political career. So I don't put much stock in it. But once again, it is just that bubbling under the surface dissonant voices. And even if you want to write off a lot of these people as controlled opposition, in which case I think there is a fair case to be made with that. Uh, it is quite interesting that they even had to employ those tactics in the first place. So that's all I have for the midterms, the real domestic American political situation for the time being. But I do have some Korean news from both Koreas to close out with. If you have, unless you have anything else about this.
No, nothing about the midterms. I do have one sort of ridiculous clown world at the end, but I'll save it for later.
Okay, so just a couple things out of Korea. So you had North Korean missile tests in which they were able to actually fire missiles all the way over Japan. So you have, I guess you could say this is a return to normal. So we did get the promise that Biden did give us that the world would return to normal once he came to office. So,
Mm.
but you, I mean, this is the solidification of the end of Trump's attempted detente on the Korean Peninsula. That North Korea has completely returned to form on this, and that they're certainly in the position of power. And while economic power and theoretical military power may be on South Korea's side, the Korea that really defines Korea is in the north. It is the DPRK. And that is for a variety of factors. Number one, just the brazenness, just the fact that it's willing to assert itself. And I would say that even though it is a Juche state, even though it does have a lot of the mid 20th century Marxist Leninist things, even a lot more of the negative elements, admittedly, it is still a much more distinctly Korean state than whatever the hell is south of the border right now. And I mean, South Korea is also infamous for being one of the most Americanized countries in the world. You could go through the litany of social problems that a country like that does have, which I'll spare you for the time being. But speaking of South Korea, there was an explosion of an ammo dump in South Korea. Some people speculate sabotage, and this was around the same time as the missile strike. So you could see, and I don't even want to necessarily say this, the Korean Peninsula come back into the news cycle much more in much greater force over the next few weeks, over the next few months, over the next few years. But I would say that would once again mostly come from North Korea. And as far as I know, that the South is still more open to negotiation than the North is. But at this point, I think it's safe to say, especially with a lot of the loss in legitimacy in the American empire, that the dominant Korea, even though maybe not on paper, is North Korea.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised. It's the most brazen they've ever been. Um, I don't know. Maybe they Maybe they smell mature liberalism too. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I, I would if I were in their position. I mean, frankly, okay, so you have reconciliation with Russia and China on Korea's part, on North Korea's part, that is. You have an American empire that is certainly giving up some amount of influence and is really expending itself that is not what it used to be. You have a social situation in South Korea, which, I mean, it was announced today the new birth rate figures that came out, lowest in the world at 0.75. Now, North Korea is
Wow.
certainly nowhere near replacement rate. It's at like 0.81, 0.91. But, I mean, if you just let demographics play out in a vacuum, it's clear who's going to win that conflict. And it's clear if you want to make that the judge of the success of a governing system or an ideology, it looks like Juche won over liberal democracy, to say the least. And, I mean, look, I'm no expert on Korea or Korean culture or the current state of either North or South Korea, but I would say, and a lot of people, even just up until a few years ago, including myself, would have looked at me like I'm insane. That indisputably North Korea is the more functional Korea, despite some of the more unsavory elements about it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's just all the brief news I had, and you've enticed me with your promise of a clown world story. What may that
Well,
be?
well, I mean, it's I consider it incredibly clownish. So, there was a headline from the New York Times, which is just it's mind-boggling stupid. It, I don't even know, like, how do you even come up with this? So, um, this was, I think, the day after the first strike, so it was probably on the 11th, might have been on the 12th. Um, the New York Times. Let me just find it here. Oh yes, here's the headline: the Russian missile attack that killed at least 19 people across Ukraine on Monday were wide-ranging, but they were not as deadly as they could have been. That has renewed questions over the quality of Russia's weapons. So, it's so ridiculous. Like, they're trying very hard not to kill civilians. They're so they have to come up with a headline that says Russia is incapable of pinpoint strikes. Uh,
Yeah, it
and their their missiles don't blow up good like ours do. But it's such a
also they have a
ridiculous.
shortage of missiles. The largest military manufacturer in the world has a shortage of missiles, by the way.
Oh yes, that's right. But it also made me think of Putin's speech. You know, when he brought up Dresden and in Tokyo, but and Hiroshima, of course. But um, a lot of people in our sphere will think of Dresden, and we'll be happy he mentioned it and so on. But I think what he was trying to do is say, we're not, again, he's reiterating, we're not going to prosecute this war the way the Americans prosecute wars. Although I think in the end, they will have to. But I just thought it was hilarious that they just contorted this ridiculous headline to accuse Russia of because of course they have to go with their genocide, right? And the Russians don't have accurate missiles, and they don't want to minimize civilian deaths. They just have bad missiles that don't blow up real good. It's that stupid.
Yeah, it's I remember seeing that exactly, and it is comical just what they had managed to crank out in regard to that. And I mean, yeah, it's okay. So at the beginning of the war, they said, "Oh, Russia isn't holding back; they're just incompetent." Then you get to hear it's like, "Oh, Russia's finally not holding back anymore, and they're unable to cause mass amounts of collateral damage because they're just incompetent." And no matter what Russia does, whether it's a good move or a bad move, even from the Russian point of
Yes,
view, it will be written off as Russia is both incompetent and evil no matter what they do. They have some
yes,
spin
yes,
doctor who will change it to be that way because that's the narrative that they have completely vested themselves in pushing. And when they don't push it, that means either one of two things: either they have capitulated, or they are preparing for a war. Now, speaking of which, I'll leave you with one last clown world story where the U.S. military, particularly the U.S. Army, was loosening standards around physical readiness, and they said that they would even be willing to accept some level of obesity in terms of even just active duty. And to me, that signals this is either a country that is not seriously preparing for a war, or a country preparing for a war to such a large scale that the only requirement for service is that you need to be a body that they can throw into a meat grinder. So, uh, both of which are not very, let's say, positive situations for the American Empire, but that's what I will leave you with while we're
Mhm.
tossing around absurd stories. That's all I had for this week.
Me too.
So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We're just over 2 hours. That's unheard of with our last string of episodes. Even though you guys seem to have been liking them, so once again, keep your eye out for the BitChute and the Substack pages because I will start to be uploading episodes there as well. And once I get everything fully within operation, they'll go up first just because of the nature of the way they upload. I can't really do a premiere on either of those. So if you want a sneak peek, you can certainly get into those. I will be sure to link both of those if you want to check them out. Once again, the War Report, I have some episodes from 2019 on there. I haven't updated in quite some time. The Substack doesn't have anything up yet. Once I get all the details worked out on that, I'll start uploading episodes and archives as much as I can. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.